This is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. It's nearly 500 kilometers long, and it runs across rivers, cuts through parishes, and slices one family's kitchen in half. You won't see a wall or a fence, but this invisible line is the result of 400 years of conquest, rebellion, and geography that refuses to cooperate with politics. So how did one small island end up divided by such an improbable border? To figure that out, we've got to follow the line's path. Let's map it out. The story starts with a flight. In September of 1607, nearly 100 Gaelic lords and their families boarded ships in Willie and sailed to the Spanish Netherlands. They were fleeing arrest after years of failed rebellions against English rule. This event, called the Flight of the Earls, left Ulster leaderless, and England's King James I saw an opportunity. Ulster was Ireland's most rebellious province, but it was also the most strategically important. It faced Scotland across the narrow sea channel, just 20 kilometers wide at its closest point. Control Ulster and you control access between North Britain and Ireland. But here's the problem. Ulster was overwhelmingly Gaelic and Catholic. So how do you control a population that doesn't want to be controlled? Well, King James had an answer. Replace them. So James launched the Plantation of Ulster, a calculated colonial project to replace the Gaelic Catholic population with loyal Protestant subjects. Between 1609 and 1620, over 20,000 settlers arrived from Scotland and England. They were granted land confiscated from the Irish lords, prime farmland in the fertile river valleys of Foyle, Bann, and Longham. The native Irish were not driven out entirely. Instead, they were pushed into marginal land, often land with poor soil, or smaller holdings. The settlers built walled towns like Derry and Coleraine. They erected Protestant churches and stone farmhouses modeled on the Scottish lowlands. Within a generation, the landscape itself reflected the division: orderly tenant farms in the valley and subsistence plots in the margins. By 1641, Ulster looked different to the rest of Ireland. Plantation grants had shifted land ownership sharply towards Protestant settlers. In many counties, a large majority of landowners were Protestant, even though Catholics still owned a big share of land nationwide. That's the first split. Not just political or religious, a demographic border, one that would cement over the next 3 centuries. If we fast forward to the 19th century, Belfast was roaring with industry. So why Belfast and not, say, Cork or Dublin? Well, geography and history gave Belfast 3 advantages. First was coal. Belfast sits directly on the Irish Sea, across from the coal fields of Scotland and northern England. Steam-powered mills and foundries needed coal, and lots of it. Shipping it from Britain was far cheaper than hauling it 200 miles overland from southern Ireland, which lacked local coal at the same scale anyways. Second was linen. The damp climate of Ulster was ideal for growing flax and processing linen. By the late 19th century, Belfast was known around the world for linen, earning the nickname Linenopolis. The third was access to British markets and capital. Belfast shipyards, engineering works, and rope factories weren't serving Ireland, they were serving the British Empire. Harland and Wolff, the shipyard that built Titanic, launched over 1,700 vessels, nearly all of them sailed for British, not Irish ports. By the turn of the 20th century, Belfast had grown to nearly 350,000 people, and for a time overtook Dublin in population. It had tramways, gas lighting, and grand Victorian buildings. It was an industrial powerhouse at the time. Meanwhile, much of the rest of Ireland remained rooted in agriculture. When the Great Famine hit in the 1840s, over 1 million people died, and many immigrated. The division of wealth and orientation between industrialized Protestant Ulster and agrarian Catholic Southern and Western Ireland hardened over decades. One region was looking towards Britain, and the other inwards towards Irish land, dreaming of an independent Ireland free from British landlords. By 1912, Ireland was on the brink of civil war, and the question everyone was asking was simple. Could Britain grant Ireland self-government without Ulster exploding into violence? The answer was no. So when London finally moved to grant Ireland limited self-government under Home Rule, Protestant Unionists in Ulster panicked. They feared a Dublin Parliament dominated by Catholics would destroy their civil and religious freedoms. So they organized. Around 500,000 people signed the Ulster Covenant, vowing to resist Home Rule if imposed. At this point, Protestants made up about 65% of Ulster's population, but that majority wasn't evenly spread. In counties like Fermanagh and Tyrone, Catholics were the majority. In Antrim and Down, Protestants dominated. The Ulster Covenant of 1912 was signed by over 470,000 men and women, nearly half the Protestant population of Ulster. It wasn't symbolic, it was a mass movement preparing for armed resistance. So they armed themselves, forming the Ulster Volunteer Force, and in 1914 they smuggled 25,000 rifles into Larne Harbour. And the British government did nothing to stop them. Well, because many of the British officers and politicians sympathized with the Unionists. During the Easter Rising of 1916, the Irish nationalists rebelled in Dublin. The country was spiraling out of control. Worried about unrest, London drew up a compromise: partition the island. To understand the border, we have to look past the historic name, Ulster, and look at the numbers. The border was drawn based on a simple calculator, not a map. The Government of Ireland Act in 1920 split the island into two parts. Northern Ireland, with 6 of Ulster's 9 counties, stayed in the United Kingdom. The other 26 became the Irish Free State. So why only 6? Well, early gerrymandering at its finest. Let's look at the numbers. If all 9 counties of Ulster had been included in Northern Ireland, the population would have been roughly 890,000 Protestants and 690,000 Catholics. That's only a 56 Protestant majority, too narrow to guarantee Unionist control, especially given higher Catholic birth rates. By excluding Cavan, Monaghan, and Donegal, the new Northern Ireland had about 820,000 Protestants and 420 Catholics, a 66 Protestant majority, much safer politically. But here's the cost. Those 3 excluded counties were left economically stranded. Towns like Clones and Monaghan had been commercial hubs tied to Belfast's market. Overnight, they became border towns in a poor agricultural state. And within Northern Ireland, the 420,000 Catholics, 1/3 of the population, found themselves in a permanent minority in a state designed to keep them that way. The line that was supposed to prevent conflict fanned the flames for the next one. Now the map gets messy. The border wasn't drawn along rivers, mountain ridges, or transport routes. It followed medieval county lines, carved centuries earlier by feuding clans and landlords. The result, a collection of geographic oddities that stick out on maps. Dromuley is almost completely surrounded by Northern Ireland. It sounds like a mapping error. It wasn't, though. To reach it from the rest of the Republic, you'd have to cross the UK, drive through the county Fermanagh, and re-enter Ireland again. It's technically an Irish penny enclave, land almost enclosed by another country. Locals joke they need a passport to visit their neighbors. In the 1920s, farmers had to cross 2 custom posts just to sell milk at the market. In Derry, the proposed border had created a central dilemma. What do you do with a city that's Catholic, but economically viable to the Protestant state? So Derry, officially Londonderry, is Northern Ireland's second largest city. Its population was mostly Catholic and nationalist, but it stayed inside the new state because of its symbolic importance to the Unionists and its role as a major industrial center. So economics beat out demographics. Derry became a Catholic majority city, governed by a Protestant majority parliament. That imbalance fueled decades of tension that would later explode during the Troubles. And some people didn't just live near the border, they lived on it. In Gortineddan, the border literally ran through the Murray's family home. The dividing line cut through the family's living room. You could sit on a chair in Northern Ireland while eating off of a table in the Irish Free State. The Murray's holding was one of 1,400 properties divided by the border, and the road outside their home was also among the 180 official crossings. And even though it seems funny, families living across the border had a harsher reality. In March of 1922, B Specials dug trenches across roads, severing motor access between Northern Ireland and the South. So surely someone would fix these absurdities, right? After partition, the Boundary Commission of 1924 was supposed to fix these problems, according to the wishes of the inhabitants. Nationalists expected a huge adjustment, maybe even reunification of the North with the Free State. Instead, the commission proposed only tiny swaps, about 31,000 people moving south and 7,600 north. When the draft leaked to a London paper in 1925, outrage followed. Owen McNeill, the Irish Free State's delegate on the Boundary Commission, resigned in protest. The report was buried. So the border stayed exactly where it was, Inconvenient, illogical, and unpopular. For most of the 20th century, that line was fortified. Army checkpoints, customs huts, and barbed wire cut through quiet farmlands. For a brief moment, it looked like the border might actually fade away. After 30 years of violence, a conflict called the Troubles, 3,500 people were dead. Bombings, assassinations, and sectarian killings had torn Northern Ireland apart. The Troubles began in 1968 as a civil rights movement. Catholics in Northern Ireland faced systematic discrimination, gerrymandered voting districts, and exclusion from jobs and housing, harassment by the police. Peaceful protests were met with violence, and paramilitary groups on both sides, the IRA on the nationalist side, loyalist groups like the UFV on the unionist side, turned to terror. The Good Friday Agreement ended most of the violence. Both sides agreed to share power. The Republic of Ireland dropped its constitutional claim to the North, and the UK accepted that Northern Ireland's status could only change if its people voted for it. And crucially, both the UK and Ireland were members of the European Union's single market, which meant that no customs checks were needed at the borders. Checkpoints vanished. You could cross the border 300 times without noticing, just a sign changing speed limits from kilometers to miles per hour. For nearly 20 years, that worked. And then Britain voted to leave Europe. In 2016, the UK voted to leave the European Union. Northern Ireland voted to remain. It was dragged out anyways. Suddenly, that invisible line became UK's only land border with the EU. And borders between different trade zones needed checks, custom forms, inspections, and tariffs. But no one wanted to rebuild checkpoints on the Irish border. Doing so would violate the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement and risk reuniting violence. So a compromise was reached. The Northern Ireland Protocol. It kept Northern Ireland aligned with some EU trade rules, which meant goods could freely flow across the Irish border. But it also created a new custom border on the Irish Sea, between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Unionists were furious. They saw it as pushing Northern Ireland closer to Ireland, and further from Britain. Once again, geography and politics, they just refused to match. Today you can cross the border without noticing. Well, your phone carrier changes and sends you a ping. Road signs switch languages. And speed limits change as well. But every mile or kilometer of that border carries some rough memories of the past. It remembers the land seized in 1609, the counties that were carved out in 1920, the checkpoints of the Troubles, the promises of 1998, and the arguments over Brexit. It's not a river or a mountain range, natural borders that make geographic sense. It's an invention, a line drawn by politics, deepened by conflict, and still dividing communities that share the same landscape. So will the border ever go away? In 2024, a major poll found that 34% of people in Northern Ireland now support a united Ireland, the highest number in decades, but it's still a long ways off. Among Catholics, it's 63%. Among Protestants, just 3%. The border today is still defined by the very same split that created it a century ago. The debate didn't finish. It's still contested, still a daily reality, and still being argued over. The only certainty is this. On a clear day, you can stand in County Donegal and look at the hills of County Derry. They're the same green, they're the same island, similar histories. They just belong to 2 different countries. Thanks so much for watching. Your support means the world. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you thought. See you next time, where we'll map out something new.